China's ambassador to Canada has just held a rare interview with a number of journalists. Liu Xie is defending China's arrest of 2 Canadians and the death sentence of another, and says China is hurt by Canada's arrest of Huawei CFO. He's also warning Ottawa against involving its allies in this diplomatic dispute. The CBC's Evan Dyer was one of the reporters to speak with the ambassador, and he joins us now live. Evan, what did the ambassador have to say?
I would say that it was a mixed bag of carrots and sticks, Katie. You know, the tone was aggrieved, but not hostile, and it was more diplomatic than the tone we're hearing from the daily briefing of the Foreign Ministry spokesperson in Beijing. For example, no personal barbs at Canadian officials, unlike the daily briefing, and also some positive talk let's take a look at the carrot side of the ledger, first of all, about things like trade, tourism. For example, on trade, saying that if this issue is resolved and Meng Wanzhou is released, then Canada wants to diversify its trade, and China could be a great partner. On the year of tourism that just ended, he was asked a question about that. He said China would be happy to extend to another year of tourism with Canada, again, if this issue is resolved. He described Canada as the country that is most favorably viewed by Chinese people in the West, seen as the most friendly and open to China. And in fact, it was in that context that he said that the detention of Meng Wanzhou was particularly hurtful. And he also walked back the comments about white supremacy. He had, of course, written an op-ed where he suggested that the detention of Meng Wanzhou was motivated partly by white supremacy and the government's defense of it also. He said today that he understands that Canadian government and society are resolutely opposed to white supremacy, and really his comments refer only to certain elements in society. So that was on the carrot side of the ledger. On the stick side, I should mention that he was also asked about Huawei. What will happen if Canada, like the US, like Australia and New Zealand, rejects Huawei from its 5G network? And he said he would expect that there would be repercussions if that happened.
One other thing that I understand that he spoke with is the upcoming trip to Davos and possibly any conversations the Canadians may be having with allies. What was his response to this widespread push we're seeing from Canada to pressure allies to put pressure on China?
More indications today that the Chinese really don't like that. He came back to that topic a few times. He said, this is not helpful. Don't believe that you're going to help yourself by going out there and recruiting other allies to take your side. He said we should use the bilateral channels that we have to talk to one another and not go to other countries. And when he was asked about Chrystia Freeland taking that message to Davos, he said, Davos is an economic forum. We would really not want the Canadians to bring up other issues there. I urge Canada to think twice before raising this issue at Davos. And he said, the countries, you may think you're helping yourself by getting these allies to help you, but Western countries do not represent international opinion. And he said, we have friends too. We have allies in China, in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America, although he didn't mention any, and no countries have publicly taken the side of China in this dispute. It sort of left the impression that that strategy is working, to be quite honest with you, Katie, that it is certainly something the Chinese are concerned about. And it dovetails with another impression I took from that, which is that the Chinese are concerned about their image as a country that arbitrarily grabs foreigners. They repeatedly made the point that you can come to China, you'll be safe if you respect our laws, and that people should not see China as a country that acts outside of the rule of law. It seemed that they were worried about their image.
Evan, thank you very much for this. We appreciate it today.
Thanks, Katie.
Tomorrow, Canada's ambassador to China will update some MPs on the situation involving the 2 detained Canadian men, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. He'll also update them on Robert Schellenberg, who has been sentenced to death for drug smuggling.
My first priority by far is to do everything in my capacity to secure the release of the 2 Michaels as quickly as possible and to help to save the life of Mr. Schellenberg.
Ambassador McCallum will appear before the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee tomorrow morning. Earlier this afternoon, I spoke with 3 MPs on that committee. Andrew Leslie is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Leona Alaslev is the Conservative critic for global security. And Hélène Laverdière is the NDP critic for foreign affairs. Ms. Alaslev, I'd like to start with you. What exactly do the Conservatives want to hear from Ambassador McCallum tomorrow?
Well, obviously, we're seized with this issue, and we think it's very disconcerting that this is one of the tensest times that we've seen in recent history between Canada and China. And so with an increased number of people being detained, we'd really like to hear what the situation is, what is Canada doing, how are we ensuring that we're advocating for the two that are arbitrarily detained, and of course for Mr. Schellenberg, who is looking at the death penalty.
Ms. Laverdiere, I want to ask you the same question. What do you want to hear from John McCallum?
I think we want to talk obviously about safety of Canadians. Safety of Canadians that are in prison in China or that have been condemned to the death penalty. Safety of Canadians who want to travel to China. So there's this big issue of safety of Canadians. There's also, of course, the question of the relations between Canada and China and how can we move forward, how can we try to assuage the current situation and what's the outlook for the future. And I'd say there's also the issue of the greater impact on what I call the world order. You know, that there's a battle right now with some governments who disregards not only the rules of law in their own territory, or what we would call or human rights in their own territory, but the way countries are supposed to behave towards one another. So there's a range of issues. We need to better understand what's going on. We need to know what the government is doing. So I think it's going to be a very important meeting.
Now, Mr. Leslie, both the Conservatives and the NDP were pushing to make this a public hearing, or at least have some part of the hearing public, so that Canadians can get an update on what's actually going on and what Canada's strategy is to deal with this. Why not just make some of, even a portion of it, public?
Well, the Prime Minister has said a great deal on the subject, and of course, as the Prime Minister of our country, he's the one that dialogues with Canadians on the details that are commensurate with their need to know, keeping in mind it's a really sensitive and delicate time, and our job, as is true of, I believe, all of my political colleagues, is to keep Canadian citizens safe and sound. And literally, lives are at risk. So John McCallum is being invited, and we supported the motion, to give a chat tomorrow. There are certain levels of detail that he will be presenting, which, if released publicly, could threaten individuals' lives, or certainly the discussions that are underway.
If I may, I'm fully in agreement with that, and I think it's very important to have a 1-hour session to discuss sensitive issues, to discuss the lives that are at risk. This is very important, but what prevents us to have before or just after, ideally before, I think, that 1-hour in-camera session, to have also a public session, because the Prime Minister is not the only one to represent the citizens of Canada. I mean, we MPs, we also represent our citizens, and they have questions, and they are entitled to hear the answers.
We're hearing from our constituencies on a regular basis, and the whole role of a standing committee, a House of Commons standing committee, is to have members of Parliament who represent their constituents to have an opportunity to question these witnesses so that we can pose those questions and Canadians can hear what those answers are. So there is an element in camera, absolutely, we agree. But there's also a public element, and certainly the minister or the ambassador is going to scrum with CBC and speak to media. So why should members of Parliament, duly elected representatives, not be offered the same courtesy?
Now, Mr. Leslie, I want to ask you something about an issue that the Conservatives have really been pushing for quite some time now since this started. And it's that the Prime Minister, the argument has nuanced a bit. When this first happened, there was a call from the Conservatives that the Prime Minister needs to get on the phone with Beijing, call up President Xi Jinping, and demand these Canadians be released. Since then, we've seen at least Foreign Affairs critic Erin O'Toole has nuanced the argument a little bit to say, well, at least open up a leader-to-leader dialogue. At what point, from your perspective, does the Prime Minister need to get on the phone with Beijing, whether it's to get an assessment or to make some demands on Canada's behalf?
The state of play right now is, as you've seen, with certain arbitrary decisions made by the Chinese government vis-a-vis Canadian citizens, where an individual now has had a court case reevaluated by Chinese courts and has been assigned the death penalty. The current state of the relationship, and there is one, and John McCallum is at the forefront of that, But in terms of responsibility of speaking to Canadians, that rests quite properly with the Prime Minister of Canada, the Minister of Global Affairs, and in a very smaller way than that, I'm here talking to you.
But in terms of the leader-to-leader phone call?
So you want to have those leader-to-leader phone calls when there's a relative degree of assurity that the outcome might be positive.
I think that's where the Conservatives disagree. I think that we actually need to see a leader-to-leader. I think that it's consistently escalating. We've now seen an increase in the number of people who have been detained or administratively held back. At what point are we going to see a Prime Minister? It's been a month and a half. It's a deteriorating situation. And so if this is a state-to-state situation, then we need our head of government, our Prime Minister, to speak to the Prime Minister of China and assure Canadians that he's addressing this and taking it with the seriousness that it deserves.
And I let me get to one point. We'll pick up right with you, Ms. Leverdier. But Mr. Leslie, you just said that you want to have a certain degree of surety that it will be a favorable outcome. Are we at that sort of speaks to the bigger, broader state of where the Canada-China relationship is right now. Is this rock bottom, or could things get worse?
Well, it's possible that things could always get worse. And we have the looming threat of the judicial killing of a Canadian citizen. That would very much be worse. So let's focus on the safety and security of Canadians. There is a dialogue between Canada and China through our elected officials, through our appointed officials, through trade representatives, through business leaders, through the over 1 million Canadians who are of Chinese descent. So there's a rich dialogue taking place right now. What we're trying to do is make sure that through inadvertent comments or questions that could be televised, in the to and fro of a parliamentary committee asking an ambassador about this, that, or the other, unfortunate questions may be asked, unfortunate answers may be given, though I doubt very much.
But I think we're talking about the Prime Minister here.
Yeah, we need to jump in and let Ms. Leverdier jump in there.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking about the Prime Minister, and it depends on the way it's done, because, the Prime Minister made some statements at time that could be interpreted as not aggressive, but, very kind of the negations of what and of course I don't agree with what the Chinese government is doing. So it could be contemplated also that it could be, a hand giving a positive signal by wanting to talk with Chinese authorities. So it all depends on the way it's being done. But also we have a dialogue mechanism with China that I think should be revived, and the contacts must be made at all levels. Civil servant and there's a lot of Canadians over there in China. There's a big Chinese community. We have to bring everybody together. And that brings me to another point. I think, and I had suggested it to the foreign minister myself, I think that the idea, and I'll give credit to the government about that, well, it's an idea I had, the idea of asking our allies to talk to the Chinese authorities also is a very good one, because everybody is affected. When a country starts doing tit for tat like that, it doesn't respect the basic rules of relations.
But I think it's an important conversation, because yes, certainly it's an option to be able to talk to our allies, but you do that in addition to also talking to the leader of the country that you have an issue with. And so if we're actually saying that the severity of the situation is not worthy at this time of the Prime Minister's attention, I'm very concerned about that. So then at what point is it worthy? Do we need to see 28 people detained? Do we need to see 100 people detained?
But is there not a risk?
At what point?
Is there a risk, and this is my last question on this issue, but is there a risk that Canada could play its hand too soon if it makes that call now to Xi Jinping? Or from your perspective, as you've argued, do you just open up a line of communication?
Well, there's no question that it's a delicate balance, but at the same time, we see the situation deteriorating, and as we just said, it can get worse. So I think we're at the point where we actually need to take this seriously and address it face to face and not have it deteriorate
There's multiple streams of communication now, and people are working very hard trying to maintain that delicate balance between making sure we stand up for that which we believe, of course, and preserving the safety and security of Canadian citizens. So this is, and I'm glad to see we're all united in a nonpartisan way on the overall issue. The reason why we're at such a delicate state in terms of who's saying what to whom is just for the reason that perhaps this thing started. So certain people, i.e. our Chinese friends, may not like sometimes that we have to say. We've still said them because that's part of our foundational tree in terms of values. But when it comes to the safety and security of lives on the line, discretion sometimes is a good defensive system. As when I was a soldier and we were going into active operations, you didn't necessarily promulgate all the information that you might want to share with your own troops with the rest of society.
On that point, we are going to leave things there. Thank you very much, Andrew Leslie, Leona Alislev, and Hélène Laverdière. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.